They told me I couldn't park my tractor on my own land, so I took away their parking lot. Not metaphorically, not in some petty HOA Facebook argument kind of way. I mean physically, structurally, legally. I erased it. And the crazy part is, they handed me the blueprint to do it. So here's the setup. My name's not important, but the land is. 48 acres sitting right on the edge of a small town. Used to be nothing but open pasture, wind cutting across low grass. One old red barn that creaks like it's telling stories every time the temperature shifts. My dad bought it back when nobody wanted land this far out. Back when tractors weren't considered visual pollution and neighbors didn't file complaints over the direction your mailbox faces. For 20 years, that land stayed exactly what it was meant to be, working land. Gravel drive wide enough for hay trailers, feed trucks coming in at sunrise, goats making noise like they've got opinions about everything. And right near the edge of the property, there's this turnout, just a simple gravel patch where my dad used to park his old green tractor. Still runs like a tank if you treat her right. That spot. Been there longer than most of the people in town. Then, about 2 years ago, everything changed. They built this neighborhood right up against my back fence. I'm talking brand new, cookie-cutter homes, identical pastel paint jobs, lawns so perfect they look fake, like someone photoshopped them into existence. They called it Silver Creek Estates, which already tells you the kind of energy we're dealing with. And with it came the HOA. Now, if you've ever lived near an HOA, you already know it's not really about community. It's about control. It's about people who suddenly feel like they've been handed authority over things that were never theirs to begin with. And leading that little kingdom was a woman named Denise Holbrook. Denise had this presence, always walking around like she was inspecting something, clipboard in hand, sunglasses way too big for her face, like she was hiding from accountability, or maybe just the sun reflecting off her own ego. You could tell immediately, this wasn't about keeping the neighborhood nice. This was about power. The first time she approached me, I was out near the fence line, checking a broken latch. She didn't wave, didn't introduce herself properly, just stood there on the other side like she was already annoyed. She goes, "You're the one with the tractor, right?" And I remember just pausing for a second, thinking, well, yeah, that's kind of how farms work. I said, yeah, that'd be me. She adjusts her sunglasses, looks past me like she's scanning for violations instead of having a conversation. That equipment, it and Oppos, visible from our main road. It creates visual inconsistency. Visual inconsistency. I almost laughed right there, but something in her tone told me she wasn't joking. I said, ma'am, that tractor's been sitting there longer than your neighborhood's been a blueprint. She didn't even flinch, just tapped her clipboard like it was a badge. Our community has standards, and your setup is affecting property values. That right there. That's when I realized we weren't having the same conversation. I was talking about land. She was talking about control. I told her straight, that's my land. Has nothing to do with your HOA. She gave me this tight smile, like she'd already decided how the story was going to end. We'll see. And that should have been the end of it. It should have just been another weird neighbor interaction you tell over dinner and forget about. But a week later, I walk outside early morning, coffee still hot in my hand, goats already yelling at me like I'm late to my own job, and there it is. Bright orange notice zip-tied to my fence. Big bold letters. Unauthorized storage. Cease immediately. Now at first, I genuinely thought it was a joke. Like maybe one of my buddies thought it'd be funny to mess with me. But then I saw the signature at the bottom. Denise Holbrook, HOA president. And suddenly it wasn't funny anymore. I stood there for a minute just staring at it, letting that sink in. Because this wasn't just someone complaining. This was someone trying to reach across a property line and tell me what I can do on land my family's owned for decades. So I did what anyone would do. I drove straight over there. I didn't call, didn't email, didn't wait. I got on that tractor, the same one she had a problem with, and drove it right down to their little HOA office like it was making a point on its own. Gravel popping under the tires, engine loud enough to shake whatever fragile sense of order they had going on. And when I got there, she was already outside, like she'd been expecting it. Clipboard in hand again, sunglasses on, posture stiff like she was about to issue a citation instead of have a conversation. She didn't say hello. Just, you can't park that here. I shut off the engine, climbed down slow, looked her dead in the eye. You can't put notices on my fence. And that's when it escalated. She started talking about bylaws, community standards, aesthetic guidelines. Words stacked on top of each other like they were supposed to mean something out here where land actually does things. I pointed back toward my property. That gravel spot? That's mine. Always has been. She pointed at her clipboard again. Our regulations apply to anything visible from the neighborhood. That sentence, that's when I knew she wasn't just overstepping. She genuinely believed she had the authority. And that's dangerous. Because people like that, they don't stop at a warning. And sure enough, the next day, I walk out, and my tractor's gone. Just gone. Now you gotta understand, there are very few things that'll flip a switch in someone who works land for a living. We deal with storms, broken equipment, long days. None of that gets under your skin like someone putting their hands on something that's yours without permission. I found it about half a mile down the road. Parked crooked, like whoever moved it didn't even know what they were doing. And standing there, looking at it, that's when something shifted. Because now it wasn't about a complaint. It wasn't about property values or visual inconsistency. It was about someone deciding they could cross a line and expecting me not to respond. And that's when I started thinking, not about arguing, not about complaining, but about solving the problem in a way they couldn't ignore. And the funny thing is, the solution had been sitting there the whole time, right behind my fence line, their parking lot. Now let me pause right here for a second, because this is where a lot of people get it twisted, and honestly, it's exactly how situations like this spiral out of control in the first place. According to standard procedure, an HOA only has authority over properties that are legally part of its association, meaning you signed into it, your deed is tied to it, and you agreed to those rules when you bought the place. That's the deal. No signature, no jurisdiction. Simple as that. But what Denise was trying to do, that's a classic overreach move. She wasn't enforcing rules, she was testing boundaries. From a legal perspective, what really matters here is property lines and something called an easement. Now, I'm not going to hit you with textbook language, but think of it like this. If a piece of land is technically yours, but someone else has limited rights to use it, those rights don't magically turn into control. They don't get to make rules on it. They don't get to dictate what happens on it. They just get access under specific conditions. And in my case, that overflow parking they'd been using, it sat partially on my land, which meant I had leverage they didn't even realize they'd given me. But here's where it gets more interesting, because this wasn't just about land. This is a psychological trap. People in positions like Denise, HOA presidents, committee heads, whatever title you give them, they operate in environments where compliance is normal. Everyone around them follows the rules, keeps things neat, doesn't push back. So over time, they stop distinguishing between actual authority and perceived authority. It all feels the same to them. And the moment someone outside that system doesn't comply, it doesn't register as, oh, I don't have control here. It registers as this person is a problem. And that's exactly what happened. She wasn't reacting to my tractor. She was reacting to the fact that I didn't fall in line. And once someone like that decides you're the problem, they escalate. Not because they're right, but because backing down would mean admitting they never had control to begin with. And that's the moment you gotta be careful, because now it's not about rules anymore. It's about ego. And ego doesn't negotiate. So yeah, once I realized this wasn't about rules anymore, it was about ego, I stopped thinking like a guy arguing with an HOA and started thinking like a guy who actually understood the ground he was standing on. And that's when everything clicked. Because right behind my fence line, running along the back edge of their neighborhood, there was this narrow strip of concrete they used as overflow parking. Nothing fancy, just a long slab where guests would leave their cars when their perfect little driveways filled up. On paper, it was theirs. In practice, it wasn't that simple. Years back, when their developer rushed to finish construction, they poured that slab about 6 feet over the actual boundary line. 6 feet onto my property. And instead of fixing it, instead of coming to my dad and handling it the right way, they did what people usually do when a mistake is inconvenient. They ignored it. Quietly used it. Hoped nobody would ever make it an issue. Well, now it was an issue. That night, I walked that strip slow. No rush, no anger, just measuring steps, looking at where their concrete met my dirt, where the line actually ran. You ever have one of those moments where everything just lines up in your head? Not emotional, not reactive, just clear. That was it. By the time I got back to the house, I wasn't mad anymore. I had a plan. Next morning, I made a call to a buddy of mine who runs a lumber yard a couple towns over. Told him I needed materials, Nothing pretty, nothing decorative. Just solid, functional wood. Something that could go up fast and stand its ground. He didn't ask many questions, just said, "How big?" I told him, "Big enough to make a point." By midweek, I had everything delivered. Panels, beams, hardware, and by Friday morning, I was out there at sunrise, tools laid out, coffee going cold because I wasn't stopping. Now here's the part that makes people think this was some impulsive revenge move. It wasn't. Every inch of that structure was placed with intention. I didn't build randomly. I built exactly where that 6-foot overlap existed. Exactly where I had the legal right to control access. 8 feet by 12 feet. Right across the middle of their overflow parking. No windows. No paint. No attempt to make it blend in. Just raw wood, straight edges, steel hinges, and one heavy lock on the door. It wasn't there to look nice. It was there to exist. Loudly. Permanently. And by the time the sun was dropping that evening, it was done. You ever watch a place wake up to a problem they didn't expect? Next morning, I didn't even have to go looking. I heard it. Voices, car doors slamming, confusion bouncing off that neat little neighborhood like it didn't belong there. I walked out to the fence line, leaned on the post, and there she was. Denise. Standing in front of that shed like it had personally offended her. Clipboard in hand again, sunglasses on. But this time, she looked different. Not controlled. Not composed. Disoriented. She spotted me and stormed over, heels clicking like punctuation marks. "You can't build that there," she snapped, not even slowing down. I didn't move. Just let her talk. "That structure is blocking community access. It violates." I cut her off, calm as I'd been all week. "It's on my land." She shook her head immediately, like rejecting the sentence would make it untrue. "That's HOA property." And that's when I reached into my back pocket and pulled out the paperwork. Not dramatic, not aggressive, just unfolded it and held it up between us. "Easement agreement," I said. "That concrete crosses 6 feet onto my side, which means I control what happens on that 6 feet. She glanced at it, quick, dismissive. "That's not how this works." I tilted my head a little. Funny, because it is. You could see it happening in real time, that shift. The moment where confidence starts slipping and something else creeps in. Not understanding yet, but uncertainty. She tried one more angle. "You're interfering with community operations." I nodded toward the shed. "No, I'm protecting my property, especially after someone decided to move my tractor without asking." That landed. For just a second, she didn't have a response. And that silence? That was new. But people like Denise don't fold right away. They escalate. "Fine," she said, pulling herself back together. "We'll involve legal." I shrugged. "You should." And just like that, we moved into the next phase. Over the next few days, it turned into exactly what you'd expect. Emails, letters, complaints filed with the city. She tried everything. Noise complaints, zoning questions, even tried to argue the structure was unsafe. City came out, took a look, and left. Private property. Within rights. No violations. That one stung them. Then she tried rallying the neighborhood. You could see her going door to door, talking, pointing toward my side like I was some kind of problem that needed solving. But here's the thing she didn't account for. Most of those people, they didn't actually have an issue with me. Some of them bought produce from me. Eggs, vegetables, whatever was in season. I wasn't just the guy with the tractor. I was part of the ecosystem they quietly depended on. So instead of backing her up, they backed away. And that's when the pressure flipped. Because now it wasn't me versus the HOA. It was her versus reality. About 2 weeks in, I got the first letter. Not aggressive, not threatening, completely different tone. Careful, polite. They asked if I'd consider removing the shed in exchange for them building me a fully enclosed structure on my land to store my equipment. Now, a couple weeks earlier, that might have sounded reasonable. But timing matters. I read it, folded it back up, and set it on the table. Didn't respond. A few days later, another letter. Offer doubled. Better materials, faster build, even offered to cover some additional landscaping adjustments. Still no, because at this point, it wasn't about the tractor anymore. It was about the line they crossed. Finally, third letter came in, and this one felt different before I even opened it. No legal tone, no negotiation language. Just direct. They admitted fault. Plain and simple. Acknowledged that they had no authority over my land, that moving my equipment was unauthorized, and that they would no longer attempt to enforce HOA rules beyond their boundary. Put it in writing. Signed. That's what I was waiting for. Because once something's written down like that, it sticks. I took my time responding. Let it sit for a day, maybe two. Then I walked back out to that shed, stood there for a minute, looking at it. Not as a problem, but as a solution that had already done its job. And then, I moved it. Not far. About 5 feet. Just enough to clear their access again, but still sitting right there where the line had been crossed. A reminder. When Denise saw it the next morning, she didn't say anything. No clipboard, no sunglasses, no confrontation. Just a quick glance, and then she kept walking. And that was it. No more notices. No more complaints. No more pretending their rules extended past where they actually did. Everything went quiet again, but not the same kind of quiet as before. This one had understanding in it. So yeah, that's how a tractor turned into a standoff, and a parking lot turned into leverage. But if you just look at it like a gotcha story, like some clever revenge moment, you're missing the part that actually matters. Because what happened out there, it wasn't really about a shed, or a tractor, or even an HOA. It was about boundaries, the kind you can see on a map, and the kind people try to redraw without asking. The lesson here is, most conflicts don't start with something big. They start small, almost harmless. A comment, a suggestion, a friendly notice. Something that feels easy to ignore. And most people do ignore it, because pushing back feels like more trouble than it's worth. But that's exactly how situations like this grow. Because every time someone oversteps and nothing happens, it quietly becomes the new normal. And here's the thing. People like Denise don't wake up one day thinking, I'm going to cross a legal boundary today. It builds over time. They enforce a rule here, get compliance. Push a little further there, nobody resists. Eventually, they stop checking where their authority ends. Not because they're evil, but because no one ever made them stop and look. That's why this matters. Because if I had just taken that notice down and moved the tractor, none of this would have happened. No confrontation, no escalation, no shed. Things would have stayed peaceful. But it wouldn't have been peace, it would have been permission. Permission for someone else to decide what happens on land that isn't theirs. And once that door opens, it doesn't close on its own. Now don't get me wrong. This isn't about telling everyone to go out and start fights with their neighbors. That's not the takeaway. There's a difference between reacting emotionally and responding intentionally. What made this work wasn't anger, it was patience. I didn't yell, didn't threaten, didn't try to out-talk her. I let her make her move, and then I answered it with something she couldn't argue with. Structure, paperwork, position. From a legal perspective, that's always where your strength is. Not in how loud you are, not in how right you feel, but in what you can prove and where you stand. If you don't know your boundaries, literally and figuratively, someone else will define them for you. And chances are, they won't define them in your favor. And there's another layer to this that people don't talk about enough. Control feels good. It gives people a sense of order, importance, purpose, especially in environments like HOAs, where everything is designed to be predictable. Same houses, same lawns, same expectations. So when something doesn't fit that pattern, like a working farm next door, it creates friction. Not because it's wrong, but because it's different. And instead of adapting to that difference, some people try to eliminate it. This is a psychological trap. Because the moment you start believing everything around you should conform to your standards, you stop seeing where your responsibility ends. You stop asking, is this mine to control? And start assuming, if I don't like it, I should be able to change it. And that mindset, it doesn't just create conflict, it guarantees it. But here's where it flips. Because once that assumption gets challenged, once someone calmly, firmly, and legally pushes back, it forces a reset. Not just in the situation, but in how people see their own limits. That's what that shed really did. It didn't just block a parking space. It drew a line you couldn't ignore anymore. And sometimes, that's what it takes. Not aggression. Not escalation for the sake of winning. Just clarity, made visible. Now if you're watching this and thinking, all right, but what would I actually do in that situation? Start simple. Know what you own. Know what you agreed to. If you're inside an HOA, understand the rules before you challenge them. If you're outside of one, don't assume their rules apply to you just because someone says they do. And if something feels off, don't react right away. Step back, look at the structure behind it. Because 9 times out of 10, the real answer isn't emotional, it's structural. And yeah, sometimes it might look like building a shed in exactly the right place. But more often, It's just about knowing when to say no and meaning it in a way that doesn't need to be repeated. So I'll leave you with this. If someone tried to enforce rules on your property, rules you never agreed to, what would you do? Would you let it slide to keep the peace? Or would you draw the line and risk the fallout? Because one of those choices feels easier in the moment, and the other one makes sure it doesn't happen again.